Sometimes the worst mistake we make becomes the greatest blessing we never expected. Love has a way of finding us in the most impossible moments. When our hearts are closed and our hands are stained with regret, Bjorn Skarptooth was a giant, Viking warrior defending his village when his hammer struck down an innocent slave girl named Elin. When she woke up 3 days later, she looked at him and smiled. "Eirik," she whispered, "you came back to me." She thought he was someone else, someone from her past who had loved her. Bjorn could have told her the truth right away, but something in her eyes stopped him. As days passed, he found himself becoming the man she believed him to be. What happens when a warrior's greatest mistake becomes his most precious gift? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping gods, and in that grey-silver light, the village of Ravens Hollow seemed carved from the very bones of the earth itself. Wooden longhouses stretched along the rocky shore, their carved dragon heads peering through the fog as if watching for threats from the sea. Smoke rose from countless hearths, carrying the scent of burning pine and the promise of warm bread. This was a place where men had lived and died for generations, where every stone knew the weight of history, and every tree had witnessed both triumph and sorrow. Bjorn Skarptooth stood at the edge of his property, watching the village wake. At 6 feet and 7 inches, with shoulders broad as a ship's beam, he cast a shadow that could darken a doorway even in full sunlight. His beard, black as winter nights and streaked with premature silver, fell nearly to his chest. Scars mapped his arms like the tributaries of some violent river, each one a story, each one a reminder of battles won and comrades lost. The villagers called him Skarptooth, not for any dental peculiarity, but for the way his blade bit clean and sharp through enemy shields. His hammer rested against the doorframe of his longhouse, a weapon passed down through 4 generations of his family. The iron head bore the marks of countless battles, and the oak handle had been worn smooth by the grip of warriors long dead. It was both tool and legacy, both protection and burden. In Bjorn's massive hands, it became an extension of his very soul, a soul that had grown heavy with the weight of too many victories and too many lonely nights. The longhouse behind him stood apart from the others, larger and more isolated. Where other homes buzzed with the laughter of children and the chatter of wives, Bjorn's dwelling remained silent, except for the crackling of his solitary fire. He had built it for a family he thought he would have, with rooms meant for children who never came, and a hearth sized for gatherings that never happened. 3 winters passed. The woman he had hoped to marry chose a gentler man, one whose hands knew the plough better than the sword. "I cannot love a man who speaks only in thunder," she had told him, and her words still echoed in the empty spaces of his home. Now he lived alone, with his reputation and his regrets, respected by all but known by none. The village children scattered when he walked the paths, not from fear of cruelty, for Bjorn had never raised his hand to the innocent, but from the sheer overwhelming presence of him. He was a mountain that walked like a man, a storm that had learned to wear human shape. Down in the village proper, where the lesser houses clustered around the great hall of Jarl Magnus, a different kind of morning was beginning. In the kitchen of the Jarl's longhouse, Elin moved with the silent grace of someone who had learned that visibility meant vulnerability. Her hands, pale and delicate as birch bark, worked without sound as she tended the cooking fires and prepared the morning meal. She was small even for a woman, barely reaching most men's shoulders, with hair the color of winter wheat that she kept braided and hidden beneath a simple cloth. Elin's wooden comb lay hidden in her sleeping alcove, the only possession she had managed to keep from her life before. Carved with tiny flowers that spoke of gentler times, it was worn smooth from years of secret use. She would take it out only in the darkest hours before dawn, running it through her hair while she whispered to herself about memories that felt more like dreams with each passing season. "Eirik," she would murmur to the shadows, "do you remember the apple trees? Do you remember how we planned to plant our own orchard? These conversations with the past were her only rebellion, her only act of keeping alive the girl she had been before the raiders came, before the chains, before she learned that survival meant becoming invisible. The other slaves avoided her, not from dislike, but from a kind of protective distance. Elin's sadness was so deep and quiet that it seemed to draw sorrow from the very air. She worked without complaint, spoke only when spoken to, and moved through the household like a ghost who had forgotten she was supposed to be frightening anyone. The Jarl's wife, a stern woman named Helga, had long ago stopped trying to get more than necessary words from her. "That one's mind is somewhere else entirely," she would tell visitors. "Useful enough with her hands, but her heart died long before her body came to us." Yet there were moments when something else flickered in Elin's grey-green eyes. When she tended wounds or mixed healing drafts, her movements became sure and confident, as if muscle memory was carrying out skills learned in a different life. She knew which herbs would ease pain and which would bring sleep, knowledge that seemed to flow from some deeper well than mere slavery could account for. The village healer, a wise woman named Astrid, had noticed this and often called upon Elin to assist with difficult cases. "You have the touch," Astrid had told her once, watching Elin's gentle hands ease the fever of a sick child. "This knowledge comes from breeding, not bondage. Who were you before?" But Elin had only shaken her head, her face closing like a door against the question. "I am who I am now," she had whispered. "The past is buried with the dead." The truth was that Elin remembered too much and too little all at once. She remembered hands that had been gentle with her, a voice that had spoken her name like a prayer, the feeling of being precious to someone. But the face that went with those memories remained frustratingly unclear, like trying to see the bottom of a deep pool through rippling water. She knew his name had been Eirik, knew he had loved her, knew they had planned a life together that the raiders had stolen along with everything else. Beyond that, the details shifted and blurred, leaving her with an ache that had no remedy. Jarl Magnus ruled Ravenshollow with the steady hand of a man who had earned his position through wisdom rather than conquest. Grey-bearded and thoughtful, he was the kind of leader who listened more than he spoke and who understood that true strength sometimes meant knowing when not to use it. His hall was always open to those who sought justice or counsel, and his table welcomed travelers who brought news from distant lands. This morning, as every morning, he emerged from his private chambers to find Elin already at work, the fires burning bright and the first meal of the day nearly ready. He had grown accustomed to her silent efficiency over the 3 years since she'd been brought to his household, and like some jarls who saw slaves as merely useful animals, Magnus had always been troubled by the institution. He kept slaves because the world demanded it, but he treated them with as much dignity as circumstance allowed. "Elin," he said gently, as she served him his morning bread and ale. "The merchant Gunnar arrives today with goods from the eastern settlements. He always brings news. Would you like to hear what word he carries of the wider world?" She paused in her serving, just for a moment, and Magnus caught a glimpse of something desperate and hopeful in her expression. But it passed quickly, replaced by the careful blankness that was her usual mask. "Thank you, my lord," she said softly. "But news of the world beyond brings only pain to those who cannot touch it." Magnus nodded, understanding. Still, he made a mental note to listen carefully to Gunnar's tales. Sometimes the merchant brought word of distant kinfolk searching for lost family members, and there was always the chance that someone somewhere was looking for the quiet girl who worked in his kitchen. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing Ravenshollow in all its rugged beauty. The village was prosperous by the standards of the time, blessed with good harbours for the fishing boats and fertile ground for crops. Trade ships arrived regularly, bringing goods from distant lands and taking away the fruits of local labour. It was a place where a man could live well if he was willing to work, and where the strong protected the weak according to the old codes. But even in such a place, even among people who tried to live with honor, there were currents of tension that ran beneath the surface like underground streams. The world beyond Raven's Hollow was growing more dangerous each year. Raiders from across the sea grew bolder and more desperate. Neighboring clans eyed each other's prosperity with increasing hunger. And in the great kingdoms to the south, powerful men were consolidating their control, swallowing up smaller settlements like Raven's Hollow with each passing season. Bjorn felt these tensions in his bones, the way an old wound aches before a storm. His isolation was not just personal preference, it was the natural response of a man who had seen too much of what people could do to each other when pressed by fear or greed. He had served other jarls in his younger days, had carried his hammer to distant battlefields in causes both noble and questionable. The scars on his body told of victories, but the deeper scars on his spirit spoke of the price such victories demanded. Now, in his 32nd year, he had found a kind of peace in his solitude. He tended his own land, kept his own counsel, and answered the call to defend Raven's Hollow when threats arose. It was not the life he had imagined for himself as a young man, but it was honest work that let him sleep without nightmares most nights. As the morning wore on, both Bjorn and Elin went about their separate routines, unaware that fate was already moving the pieces into position for their collision. The silver pendant that hung around Bjorn's neck, a simple piece inherited from his father, caught the light as he worked, the same light that illuminated Elin's hidden comb with its carved flowers. Both carried pieces of the past, both had learned to live with loneliness, and both were about to discover that sometimes the most profound changes come dressed as the most terrible accidents. The day promised to be like any other in Raven's Hollow, with its mixture of honest work and quiet hopes. But in the wide world beyond the fjord, ships were already moving across dark waters, carrying men whose intentions would soon test every bond of loyalty and courage the village possessed. Neither Bjorn nor Elin could have known, as they moved through their familiar morning tasks, that before another sunset, their separate worlds would collide with the force of a falling mountain, changing both their lives forever. The attack came with the dawn, as such things always did, when honest folk were still heavy with sleep and the watch was changing. Elin was drawing water from the well when she heard the first war cry echo across the fjord, a sound that turned her blood to ice and sent her tumbling back through time to memories she had tried so hard to bury. Black ships had appeared in the harbour like ravens descending on carrion, their hulls cutting through the morning mist with predatory grace. The raider's banner flew from the lead vessel, a torn piece of dark cloth bearing the symbol of a wolf's head wreathed in flames. Even from a distance, Elin could see that symbol clearly, and it struck her like a physical blow. She had seen it before, years ago, when different raiders had destroyed her first life and stolen her freedom. Raiders! Raiders in the harbour! The cry went up from the watchman's horn, a deep, mournful note that brought every soul in Raven's Hollow stumbling from their beds and reaching for weapons. But these attackers had timed their assault. Well, they were already charging up the beach by the time the village had shaken off sleep's grip. Bjorn emerged from his longhouse like a bear roused from winter's den, his hammer in one hand and his shield in the other. He had slept in his clothes, as was his habit during troubled times, and the leather armor he wore bore the scuffs and stains of countless battles. His black beard bristled with fury as he took in the scene. At least 40 raiders, well-armed and moving with the discipline of experienced killers, formed the shield wall. He roared, his voice carrying over the chaos like thunder rolling down from the mountains. "Protect the hall! Drive these dogs back to the sea!" The men of Raven's Hollow responded to his command with the speed of long practice. They might not love Bjorn for his gentle companionship, but they trusted him absolutely when it came to matters of war. His tactical mind was as sharp as his blade, and his presence on a battlefield was worth a dozen ordinary warriors. Elin found herself caught between the well and the Jarl's longhouse as the battle lines formed. She should have run for the safety of the hall's thick walls, should have followed the other women and children to the stronghold where they could bar the doors and wait out the violence. But something about that black banner had frozen her in place. awakening memories that came flooding back with the force of a burst dam. She remembered another dawn, another attack, another group of raiders bearing that same wolf head symbol. She remembered being 17 and free, the daughter of a jarl in a prosperous settlement 3 days' sail to the north. She remembered hands reaching for her as her father's hall burned, remembered the feel of chains around her wrists, remembered watching her betrothed, young Eirik, fall beneath a raider's axe as he tried to reach her. The memories hit her so hard that she staggered, one hand pressed to her chest, as if she could somehow hold her breaking heart together through force of will. This was why that banner terrified her. These might be the very same men who had destroyed her first life, or their allies, or men who followed the same cruel code. Elin! Get to safety! Astrid the healer was running toward her, the old woman's face tight with concern. This is no place for you, child. But before Elin could move, the battle lines crashed together with the sound of thunder made solid. Steel rang against steel, war cries mixed with screams of pain, and the organized defense of Ravenshollow began to break apart under the raiders' savage assault. Bjorn fought at the center of the chaos, his hammer rising and falling like the hand of an angry god. Where he struck, raiders fell, shields split, bones shattered, and courage failed. He was everything the village believed him to be, and more, a figure of terrible beauty in his wrath. But even he could not be everywhere at once, and the attackers had come in greater numbers than the watch had first reported. A knot of raiders broke through the shield wall near the grain stores, threatening to flank the defenders. Without thinking, Elin found herself moving toward a wounded villager who had fallen near the fighting, old Henrik the fisherman. Blood streaming from a head wound that would surely kill him if left untended. She had always been drawn to heal rather than to harm, even in the midst of violence. It was a compulsion stronger than fear, deeper than self-preservation. As she knelt beside Henrik, pressing her hands to his wound to stem the bleeding, she was completely unaware that the battle was swirling around her like a deadly storm. Bjorn saw the breakthrough and moved to counter it, his hammer whirling in great deadly arcs as he fought his way toward the threatened position. 3 raiders stood between him and the gap in their defenses, and his blood sang with the familiar music of battle. This was what he was made for. Moments like this, when everything depended on strength and will and the courage to meet death face to face. The first raider fell to a crushing blow that caved in his chest. The second managed to get his sword up in time to block, but Bjorn's hammer shattered the blade and continued on to break the man's arm. The third, seeing his comrades fall, raised his axe high and prepared to bring it down on Bjorn's skull. But Bjorn was already moving, his body flowing with the deadly grace of a master warrior. He spun to his left, bringing his hammer around in a devastating horizontal sweep that would catch the raider at the ribs and end the threat forever. It was then that he saw her. Elin knelt just behind the raider, her back to the fighting, her gentle hands pressed to Henrik's wounded head. She was exactly in the path of Bjorn's swing, and there was no time to stop, no way to redirect the blow, no hope of calling out a warning that she would hear over the din of battle. Time seemed to stretch like heated metal, each heartbeat lasting an eternity. Bjorn saw the hammer's arc, saw Elin's vulnerable form, saw the moment of impact approaching with the inevitability of falling stone. He tried to twist away, tried to pull back the blow, but momentum and gravity were masters that no man could defy. The iron head of his father's hammer caught Elin across the shoulder and the side of her head, lifting her small body and sending her tumbling across the muddy ground like a broken doll. She struck the wall of the grain store and crumpled there, utterly still, her pale hair spreading around her head like spilled wheat. The sight hit Bjorn harder than any enemy weapon ever had. The battle fury drained out of him in an instant, replaced by a horror so complete that it left him gasping. He had struck down an innocent, this gentle girl who had been trying to save a wounded man while braver souls fled to safety. "No," he whispered, the word lost in the clamor of continuing battle. Then louder, as the full weight of what he had done crashed down upon him. "No!" The raider he had been fighting took advantage of his distraction, swinging his axe toward Bjorn's unguarded side. But Bjorn's reflexes, honed by years of combat, saved him even in his moment of anguish. He caught the axe handle with his free hand and brought his hammer around in a backhand blow that crushed the man's skull. But the victory felt like ash in his mouth. As the raiders finally broke and fled back to their ships, their attack blunted by the fierce resistance of the villagers, Bjorn stumbled across the battlefield toward Elin's motionless form. Around him, men were tending their wounds and celebrating their survival, but he saw none of it. His world had narrowed to the small, broken figure lying against the grain store wall. He dropped his hammer and fell to his knees beside her, his massive hands hovering over her body as if he were afraid his very touch might cause more damage. Blood trickled from beneath her hair, and her breathing was so shallow that he had to lean close to be sure she still lived. "What have I done?" he whispered, and for the first time in his adult life, Bjorn Skarptooth wept. The tears fell onto Elin's pale cheek like rain on snow, and in that moment, the warrior who had never been defeated by any enemy found himself utterly conquered by his own terrible mistake. The black banner of the raiders disappeared over the horizon, but the damage they had wrought would linger long after their ships were forgotten. In striking down Elin, Bjorn had unknowingly set in motion events that would change both their lives forever, though neither could have imagined, in that moment of agony and unconsciousness, that this ending might somehow become their beginning. 3 days passed like years in the shadow of Bjorn's guilt. He had carried Elin's broken body to his own longhouse, ignoring the protests of Jarl Magnus and the shocked whispers of the villagers. "She will heal under my roof," he had declared, with a finality that brooked no argument. "What I have broken, I will mend." Astrid the healer had tended Elin's wounds with skilled hands, muttering prayers to the old gods as she worked. The blow had been severe, a deep gash along her scalp where the hammer's edge had caught her, and bruising that painted the left side of her face in shades of purple and black. But miraculously, her skull remained unbroken, and after the first terrifying night, when her breathing had been so shallow it barely stirred the blankets, she began to show signs of recovery. Bjorn kept vigil beside her bed, with the dedication of a monk at prayer. He had pushed aside his own table and chairs to make room for her sleeping pallet, positioning it near the hearth where the warmth would help her healing. The great warrior, who had never nursed anyone more fragile than a wounded warhorse, found himself learning the delicate arts of tending the sick, how to drip water between unconscious lips, how to change bandages without causing pain, how to read the subtle signs that meant the difference between sleep and something deeper and more dangerous. His silver pendant caught the firelight as he leaned over her, the simple piece of jewelry that had belonged to his father swaying gently with each movement. It was a modest thing, just a hammered disc of silver on a leather cord, but it bore the mark of his family line, a symbol that had been passed down through generations of warriors. He wore it always, though he rarely thought about it anymore. It was simply part of him, like his scars or his calloused hands. On the morning of the 4th day, as pale sunlight filtered through the smoke hole in the roof, Elin's eyes finally opened. Bjorn was dozing in his chair beside her bed, his massive frame somehow folded into the wooden seat that seemed far too small for him. The soft sound of her stirring brought him instantly awake, his warrior's instincts sharp even in the depths of exhaustion. She turned her head slowly, wincing at the pain the movement caused, and her grey-green eyes focused on his face with an expression that made Bjorn's breath catch in his throat. There was no fear there, no accusation or anger. Instead, her gaze held a warmth so profound, so filled with joy and relief that it seemed to light the entire room. "Eirik," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath of wind. "You found me." The words hit Bjorn like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to correct her, to explain what had really happened, but something in her expression stopped him cold. She was looking at him as if he were the answer to every prayer she had ever whispered. as if his presence alone had the power to heal wounds deeper than those his hammer had inflicted. He began, then stopped, uncertain how to proceed. Who was Eirik? Why did she think he was someone else? The blow to her head had clearly affected her memory, but the tenderness in her voice when she spoke that name suggested this was not just confusion. It was hope made manifest. I knew you would come back to me, Elin continued, her small hand reaching out to touch his face with fingers that trembled like autumn leaves. I never stopped believing. Even when they said you were dead, even when the years passed and everyone told me to forget, I knew you would find a way back to me. Bjorn felt his heart clench like a fist in his chest. This gentle girl, this innocent he had nearly killed with his careless blow, was mistaking him for someone she clearly loved with every fiber of her being. The right thing, the honorable thing, would be to tell her the truth immediately, to explain that he was not Eirik, that he was in fact the man who had hurt her. But as he looked into her eyes, saw the pure happiness that transformed her bruised features into something almost radiant, he found the words dying in his throat. How could he destroy that joy? How could he tell her that her beloved Eirik was not there, that she was alone with a stranger who had already caused her so much pain? You're safe now, he managed to say, and it was perhaps the first completely honest thing he had ever told her. Whatever else might be true, whatever complications this mistake might bring, he would keep her safe. That much he could promise. Elin smiled then, and it was like watching the sun rise after the longest night of winter. I knew you would say that, she murmured. You always promised to keep me safe. Do you remember? We were sitting by the apple trees, and you said no harm would ever come to me as long as you drew breath. Apple trees. Bjorn had never made such a promise, had never sat with anyone among apple trees, but something in the way she spoke made him wish desperately that he had. There was such longing in her voice, such perfect trust, that he found himself nodding slightly, not agreeing to a lie exactly, but acknowledging the depth of feeling behind her words. Rest now, he said gently, his rough voice softer than he had ever heard it. You're still healing. Will you stay with me? The question was asked with the vulnerability of a child afraid of the dark, and it nearly undid him completely. I will stay, he promised, and meant it with every stone of his heart. Over the following days, as Elin grew stronger, the deception became both easier and more complicated. She spoke often of their shared past, memories that belonged to her and this mysterious Eirik, but which she now believed included Bjorn. She told him about plans they had made, dreams they had shared, moments of happiness that had been stolen by raiders and slavery. Do you remember the day we carved our initials in the old oak? She asked him one afternoon as he helped her sit up to take some broth. You said the tree would remember our love, even if the whole world forgot. Bjorn found himself caught between truth and compassion, between the honorable path and the merciful one. Each story she shared painted a picture of a love so pure and deep that it seemed almost sacred. How could he tell her that the man she remembered was gone, that these precious memories were all she had left of happiness? The villagers, meanwhile, watched his transformation with growing amazement. Bjorn Skarptooth, the solitary warrior who had never shown tenderness to any living soul, was suddenly as gentle as a mother with her newborn child. He prepared Elin's meals with his own hands, helped her walk when she grew strong enough to stand, and spoke to her in tones so soft that those who overheard could barely believe it was the same man. Perhaps the blow addled his wits as well as hers, some whispered, but Astrid the healer knew better. She had seen the way Bjorn looked at Elin when he thought no one was watching, not with the confusion of a man whose mind was damaged, but with the growing wonder of someone discovering a part of himself he had never known existed. The silver pendant seemed to catch Elin's attention often, glinting in the firelight as Bjorn moved about his daily tasks. Sometimes she would reach out to touch it, a distant look in her eyes, as if she were trying to remember something just beyond her grasp. That's beautiful, she said one evening as he brought her tea made from healing herbs. It reminds me of something, but I can't quite... She trailed off, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was my father's, Bjorn said simply, which was true enough, "Of course," Elin murmured, though her expression suggested the memory remained elusive. "I should have remembered." And in that moment Bjorn realized that his deception was no longer a matter of sparing her immediate pain. She was weaving him into her memories, making him part of a love story that had never included him. With each passing day, the lie grew deeper and more complex, but also more necessary. For how could he tell her that the man she loved was dead when she looked at him with such perfect trust? How could he destroy her happiness when it was the first genuine joy he had ever been privileged to witness? The answer, he was beginning to understand, was that he could not. By the end of her first week in Bjorn's longhouse, Elin had begun to move about on her own, though she still tired easily and her head ached when she turned too quickly. The bruising on her face had faded from deep purple to yellow-green, and the cut on her scalp was healing cleanly thanks to Astrid's skilled care and the herbs that Elin herself seemed to know by instinct. It was this knowledge that first surprised everyone, including Elin herself. When Astrid came to check her wounds, Elin would quietly suggest additions to the healing salves: a pinch of willow bark for pain, honey mixed with certain flowers to prevent infection, combinations that spoke of training far beyond what any slave would have received. "Where did you learn such things?" Astrid asked one morning, as Elin demonstrated how to prepare a poultice for reducing inflammation. Elin's hands stilled for a moment, her brow furrowing as if she were trying to peer through a thick fog. My mother taught me," she said slowly. "She said healing was a gift that should never be wasted, no matter what station life might bring." She paused, then looked up at Astrid with confusion in her eyes. "But that doesn't seem right. Slaves don't have mothers who teach such things, do they?" Astrid exchanged a meaningful glance with Bjorn, who was mending a tear in his leather armor nearby. There were depths to this girl that slavery had not been able to touch, knowledge and grace that spoke of noble birth. It raised uncomfortable questions about how she had come to be in bondage, questions that might lead to truths no one was ready to face. As her strength returned, Elin began to tend to Bjorn's household with the same gentle efficiency she had shown in Jarl Magnus's hall, but with a difference that was profound. Where before she had worked with the careful invisibility of someone who had learned that notice meant danger, now she moved with quiet confidence, humming softly to herself as she went about her tasks. She found herbs and healing supplies tucked away in corners where Bjorn had forgotten them, items left over from his mother's time that he had never learned to use properly. Under her hands, the longhouse began to transform from a warrior's austere shelter into something warmer and more welcoming. She hung dried flowers from the rafters to sweeten the air, arranged the few pieces of pottery in pleasing patterns, and somehow made the rough wooden furniture seem more comfortable just by the way she arranged the furs and cushions. "You're making this place into a home," Bjorn observed one evening as he returned from checking his traps to find her stirring something fragrant in a pot over the fire. "It always was a home," Elin replied, looking up at him with that radiant smile that never failed to make his chest tight. "It just needed someone to remember what that meant." She paused in her stirring to touch his arm gently. "You work so hard taking care of everyone else. Eirik, you deserve to have someone take care of you for a change." The name still hit him like a cold wind every time she used it, but Bjorn was learning to hide his reaction. He had made discreet inquiries around the village, asking if anyone knew of a man named Eirik who might have been connected to Elin, but no one recalled such a person. It was as if this beloved figure from her past had never existed, or had been erased so completely that no trace remained. From her small pouch of healing herbs came the most precious possession she owned beside her wooden comb, a collection of plants and roots that she treated with reverent care. Some were common enough: willow bark for pain, chamomile for sleep, mint for digestion. But others were more exotic, plants that didn't grow in this region and must have come from far away. "These are from the eastern mountains," she said one day, showing him a collection of dried leaves that smelled of pine and something sharper. They're good for wounds that won't heal properly, and for drawing poison from the blood. She held them up to the light, examining their color with a practiced eye. Someone taught me that these only grow at high altitude, where the air is thin and cold. Your mother? Bjorn asked gently, sitting beside her on the bench they had pulled close to the fire. Maybe, Elin said uncertainly, or someone else. The memories are so unclear, Eirik. Sometimes I remember things, but when I try to focus on them, they slip away like mist. She looked at him with troubled eyes. Why can't I remember our time together more clearly? Surely such happiness should be burned into my mind forever. Bjorn felt the familiar twist of guilt in his stomach. Every day the deception grew more complex as Elin tried to fit him into memories that belonged to another man entirely. He found himself learning to navigate conversations about a past he had never lived, agreeing with things he had never said, pretending to remember moments that had never included him. Perhaps it's better not to force the memories, he said carefully. Sometimes the mind protects us from things that are too painful to bear all at once. This was true enough, though not in the way Elin understood it. Bjorn was beginning to suspect that her confusion about the past went deeper than just the blow to her head. There was something almost deliberate about the way certain memories seemed blocked, while others flowed freely. It was as if her mind had locked away the most painful truths to preserve her sanity. The other villagers had begun to take notice of the changes in both of them. Elin, who had been invisible for so long, was suddenly the subject of intense curiosity. The fact that she was living in Bjorn's household, and that he was treating her with such obvious care, set tongues wagging from the harbour to the furthest farmstead. She's bewitched him, some whispered. That blow must have addled her wits and awakened some kind of magic. But others, particularly the women who had worked alongside Elin in Jarl Magnus's hall, saw something different. Look at how she moves now, said Helga, the Jarl's wife, like she's remembered something about herself that she had forgotten. And those hands, I always said those were not the hands of a common slave. The speculation grew more intense when word spread about Elin's knowledge of healing. Several villagers had already sought her help with minor ailments, and her treatments proved remarkably effective. She seemed to know instinctively which herbs would help and which might cause harm, knowledge that typically took years of study to acquire. She's no ordinary slave girl, Astrid confided to Jarl Magnus one evening. I've been watching her work, and she knows things that could only come from formal training. Noble training, Magnus nodded thoughtfully. He had suspected as much from the beginning, but had never pressed the issue. Many slaves came to them with pasts they preferred not to discuss, and he had learned that sometimes ignorance was kinder than knowledge. But now, with Elin's transformation and Bjorn's obvious attachment to her, the questions could no longer be avoided. If she was indeed of noble birth, if she had been wrongfully enslaved, then her presence in Ravenshollow raised legal and political complications that could affect the entire village. For now, though, Magnus chose to wait and watch. Whatever the truth of Elin's past, she seemed happy for the first time since he had known her. And Bjorn, the solitary warrior who had never shown interest in any woman, was clearly falling in love. Though he probably didn't realize it himself yet, sometimes Magnus reflected it was better to let sleeping wolves lie. The truth had a way of revealing itself when the time was right, and forcing it too early often brought more pain than healing. As autumn deepened and the first frost touched the morning grass, Elin continued to bloom under Bjorn's protection like a flower that had finally found the right soil and sunlight. Neither of them spoke of the future or what their arrangement might mean in the long term. They lived each day as it came, finding peace in simple routines and comfort in each other's presence. But winter was coming, and with it, challenges that would test every assumption they had made about love, truth, and the price of happiness built on deception. The carved rune stone was no larger than a man's palm, worn smooth by countless hands and weathered by years of exposure to salt air and rain. Elin found it while gathering firewood behind Bjorn's longhouse, half buried beneath a pile of autumn leaves that had collected against the foundation stones. When her fingers closed around it, she felt a jolt of recognition so strong it nearly brought her to her knees. "Eirik," she whispered, brushing the dirt away to reveal the ancient symbols carved into the grey stone. "You did remember. You kept it all these years." The runes were simple but deeply carved, speaking of protection and eternal bonds. To Elin's confused memory, they seemed like a message from her beloved, proof that even in the darkest times their connection had endured. She traced the symbols with her fingertip, tears streaming down her face as what felt like a precious memory surfaced from the depths of her damaged mind. But the truth was more complex and more painful than she could have imagined. Bjorn had carved that stone 15 years earlier, during his first winter of true solitude after his mother's death. He had been barely 17, still learning to live with the weight of his reputation and the isolation it brought. The runes were indeed about protection and bonds, but they had been a prayer to the gods for the family he hoped someday to find, not a message for a love already lost. When Elin brought the stone to him that evening, her face glowing with joy and remembered love, Bjorn felt the familiar twist of guilt and growing affection that had become his constant companions. She placed it in his massive hands with the reverence one might show a holy relic. "I knew you would have kept it," she said softly, "even when I thought I had lost everything. Some part of me always believed you would keep the promises we made." Bjorn stared down at the stone, remembering the lonely boy who had carved it, and felt the weight of her trust like a physical burden. Every day the deception grew deeper. Every conversation wove him more tightly into a web of lies that had begun with compassion, but was becoming something far more complicated. "Tell me about the day you made this," Elin said, settling beside him on the bench near the fire. "I remember pieces, but I want to hear it in your voice." This was the worst part, when she asked him to recall shared memories that had never included him. Bjorn had learned to navigate these conversations carefully, speaking in generalities and letting her fill in the details from her own fractured recollections. But tonight, with the stone warm in his hands and her eyes bright with expectation, he found himself wanting to give her something true. "I was thinking about the future," he said slowly, which was honest enough, "about what it might hold, and whether I would face it alone or with someone who mattered." Elin nodded, her expression growing soft with what she believed was shared memory. "You were always worried about being alone. Even then, when we were young and thought we had all the time in the world." She leaned against his shoulder, a gesture so natural and trusting that it made his heart race. "I told you then that you would never be alone as long as I lived. I meant it, Eirik, I still mean it." The words hit him like hammer blows, each one driving home the depth of the deception he was maintaining. She loved him, or rather, she loved the man she believed him to be. But increasingly, Bjorn was finding it difficult to tell where Eirik ended and he began. Under her gentle influence, he was becoming someone he barely recognized, softer, more thoughtful, capable of tenderness he had never known he possessed. The changes had not gone unnoticed by the rest of Ravenshollow. Where once Bjorn had been a figure of distant respect and barely concealed fear, he was now the subject of intense curiosity and growing gossip. The transformation of the grim warrior into something approaching a doting husband had the entire village talking. "Look at how he watches her," the fishermen's wives murmured as they mended nets by the harbor. "Like she might disappear if he looks away for even a moment. And have you seen how she's changed him?" added Ragnhild, the blacksmith's wife. "Yesterday I saw him helping old Eirik repair his roof, and he was actually smiling." Smiling? When have any of us ever seen Bjorn Skarptooth smile? The truth was that Elin had awakened something in Bjorn that he had thought long dead, a capacity for joy, for hope, for the simple pleasure of sharing daily life with another person. She had a way of finding beauty in the smallest things that made him see his world through new eyes. When she exclaimed over the colors of sunset reflecting on the fjord, he found himself stopping his work to really look at the sky for the first time in years. When she laughed at the antics of the village children, he discovered that he too could find amusement in their play, but perhaps most importantly, She had shown him what it felt like to be needed, not for his strength or his skill with weapons, but for himself. She sought his company not because he could protect her from enemies, but because she simply enjoyed being near him. She asked his opinion on small domestic matters, not because he was the village's greatest warrior, but because she valued his thoughts. It was a kind of acceptance he had never experienced, and it was changing him in ways that went deeper than anyone could see. The other villagers began to seek him out in ways they never had before. Where once they had approached him only when danger threatened, now they came with smaller problems, domestic disputes, and questions about farming or trade. It was as if Elin's presence had made him seem more approachable, more human. "You're different with her," Astrid observed one day when she came to check on Elin's continued recovery. "Gentler. It suits you." Bjorn didn't know how to respond to that. Gentleness had never been something he aspired to or thought himself capable of. But under Elin's influence, he was discovering aspects of his own nature that surprised him. He found himself speaking more softly, moving more carefully, thinking before he acted in ways that had nothing to do with battle strategy and everything to do with preserving the peace and happiness that had somehow taken root in his previously solitary life. Yet even as he reveled in these changes, the weight of his deception grew heavier with each passing day. Elin's trust in him was absolute, her love transparent and freely given. She spoke often of their future together, making plans that assumed a shared past he had never lived, and promises he had never made. "When winter comes, we should make a pilgrimage to the sacred grove," she said one evening as they shared their meal. "Do you remember? We always said we would go there together when we were finally reunited." "I want to give thanks to the gods for bringing you back to me," Bjorn nodded. Though his heart was heavy with the knowledge that no gods had brought them together, only his own terrible mistake and her damaged memory. Still, he found himself looking forward to such a journey, imagining the peace of walking with her through quiet forests, away from the complicated web of lies that surrounded them in the village. The rune stone had taken a place of honor on the shelf above their hearth, and Elin would often touch it as she passed, as if drawing strength from what she believed it represented. To her, it was proof that love could survive any separation, that promises made in youth could endure through the darkest times. To Bjorn, it had become something else entirely, a reminder of the man he had been before she came into his life, and a symbol of the man he was trying to become. Whether that transformation was built on truth or deception seemed to matter less with each day that passed. What mattered was the woman who smiled at him each morning as if he were the answer to every prayer she had ever whispered, and the growing certainty that he would do anything, bear any burden, live any lie, to keep that smile lighting up his world. The broken shield had hung on Bjorn's wall for nearly a decade, a relic of his father's final battle that he had never been able to bring himself to repair or discard. The oak wood was split down the middle where an enemy axe had found its mark, and the iron boss was dented from the blow that had ended Thorvald Ironhand's life. It was a monument to failure, a reminder that even the strongest warriors eventually fall. Elin found it on a grey morning when she was cleaning the far corners of the longhouse, areas that Bjorn's solitary habits had left untouched for years. She lifted it down from its pegs with gentle hands, examining the damage with the same careful attention she gave to wounded people. "This was a good shield once," she said when Bjorn returned from checking his traps to find her sitting by the fire with the broken pieces in her lap. "Strong oak, well-made ironwork. It protected someone you loved." Bjorn's throat tightened. "My father's. He fell carrying it in the Battle of Stormfjord, and you've kept it broken all these years," Elin observed, not as a criticism but as a gentle understanding. "Sometimes we think that mending what's broken means forgetting what broke it." She had already begun to work, using thin strips of leather to bind the split wood back together. Her hands moved with practiced skill, and Bjorn realized this was yet another ability that spoke of noble training. Shield repair was not knowledge that came to slaves. It was a craft taught to the daughters of warrior families, women who might need to tend their men's war gear when smiths were not available. "You don't have to," he began, but she looked up at him with such gentle determination that the words died in his throat. "Let me do this for you, Eirik," she said softly. "You've given me so much. Let me give you something in return. Besides," she added with a small smile, "what good is a warrior with a broken shield gathering dust? Your father would want it to serve again, to protect the son he loved." Over the following days, she worked on the shield whenever her other tasks allowed. The repair was slow and meticulous, requiring patience and skill that spoke of years of training. She reinforced the split with carefully woven leather, using techniques that seemed to flow from muscle memory rather than conscious thought. "My mother taught me this," she said one evening as she worked by firelight, though her brow furrowed as if the memory were unclear. "Or was it someone else? I remember hands guiding mine, showing me how to make the binding strong but flexible." She paused, looking troubled. "Sometimes I remember things that don't seem to fit with being a slave." Why would a slave know how to repair a warrior's shield? Bjorn felt the familiar pang of guilt, but also a growing understanding. The more time he spent with Elin, the more convinced he became that she had not been born to bondage. Everything about her, her knowledge, her bearing, her instinctive understanding of noble customs, spoke of a heritage that slavery had tried but failed to erase. "Perhaps you learned many things before your life changed," he said carefully. "Knowledge has a way of staying with us, even when other memories fade." The village had begun to treat them as a settled couple, though no formal announcement had been made. Invitations came addressed to both of them. Children ran to Elin for scraped knees and minor ailments, and the other women included her in their conversations about domestic matters and local gossip. It was as if the community had collectively decided that Bjorn and Elin belonged together and was adjusting its social fabric accordingly. This acceptance brought new responsibilities and new challenges. During the harvest festival, they were expected to participate as a unit, sharing the ceremonial bread and mead that symbolized the bonds between households. Elin moved through the rituals with natural grace, as if she had been raised to such occasions, while Bjorn found himself enjoying communal celebrations for the first time in his adult life. "Look at them," Magnus observed to his wife as they watched Bjorn and Elin dancing around the harvest fire. "Have you ever seen him look so content? And she moves like she was born to such gatherings." Helga nodded thoughtfully. "There's nobility in her bearing, husband." "I've thought so from the beginning. This arrangement may be more complicated than it appears." But for Bjorn and Elin, lost in the simple joy of shared celebration, such complications seemed distant and unimportant. What mattered was the warmth of her hand in his, the sound of her laughter mixing with the music, the way the firelight caught the gold in her hair. For this one perfect evening, the deception felt less like a lie and more like a truth they were creating together. The shield repair became a symbol of their deepening relationship. Each evening Elin would work on it while Bjorn tended to other tasks, and they would talk about small things, the day's events, plans for winter preparations, observations about village life. These conversations had a domestic intimacy that was new to both of them, a sense of shared purpose and mutual care that neither had experienced before. "Tell me about your father," Elin said one night as she tested the flexibility of the leather bindings. "What kind of man was he?" Bjorn found himself speaking more openly than he had in years, sharing memories of Thorvald's wisdom and strength, his dedication to family and community. As he talked, he realized that his father would have approved of Elin, would have seen in her the qualities that make a true partner: loyalty, kindness, the strength that comes from gentleness rather than force. "He sounds like a man worth honoring," Elin said when he finished. "I'm glad his shield will serve again." But even as their bond deepened, external pressures were building that would soon threaten their fragile happiness. Word had begun to spread beyond Raven's Hollow about the mysterious slave girl who had captured the heart of the legendary warrior. Traders carried gossip to distant settlements, and that gossip reached ears that had been listening for news of a particular lost daughter for 3 long years. In a hall 2 days' ride to the north, a middle-aged warrior named Gunnar Bloodaxe heard a merchant's tale about a slave girl with healing knowledge and noble bearing. The description matched someone he had been seeking since raiders destroyed his settlement and scattered his family to the winds. His daughter had been 17 when she was taken, fair-haired and gentle-handed, betrothed to a young man named Eirik who had died trying to save her. The news filled Gunnar with hope and rage in equal measure. If this girl was indeed his Elin, then someone would answer for the years of slavery she had endured. And if she had found love again, if she was truly happy with this Bjorn Skarptooth, then perhaps some good could come from the darkness that had swallowed his world. But first, he would have to see for himself. He would have to determine whether this slave girl was truly his lost daughter, and whether her current situation was rescue or simply a different kind of captivity. As autumn deepened into winter's approach, Elin finished her work on the shield. The repair was masterful, the broken pieces bound together so skillfully that the mended areas seemed to add strength rather than weakness to the whole. When she presented it to Bjorn, her face glowing with pride in her work, he felt his heart swell with emotions he couldn't fully name. "It's beautiful," he said, running his fingers over the smooth leather bindings. "You've made it stronger than it was before." "Sometimes broken things can be mended into something better," Elin replied. And though she was speaking of the shield, both of them understood that she meant something much more personal. Neither of them could have known that their time of peace was drawing to a close, that forces were already in motion that would soon test every bond they had forged, and every truth they thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the price of happiness built on secrets. The truth scroll arrived on a bitter morning, when ice rimmed the edges of the fjord and the wind carried the promise of an early winter. It came with Olaf the Wanderer, a traveling merchant whose weathered face and careful eyes marked him as a man who had seen much of the world and learned to navigate its dangers with equal parts cunning and caution. The parchment was small and travel-worn, sealed with wax that bore the mark of a settlement called Ironwood Bay. Olaf handed it to Jarl Magnus with the solemnity of a man delivering news that would change lives. Though even he could not have predicted how profoundly his message would shake the foundations of Ravenshollow. "Gunnar Bloodaxe sends word," Olaf explained as Magnus broke the seal. "He's been searching for 3 years, following every whisper and rumor. When he heard tell of a slave girl with healing knowledge living among you, he bid me bring this inquiry." Magnus read the message in silence, his weathered face growing more troubled with each line. The words were simple enough, but their implications stretched like cracks through stone, threatening to shatter everything that had seemed solid and certain. The scroll told a story that began with flames and ended with questions that had no easy answers. 3 years ago, raiders had swept down upon Ironwood Bay like wolves upon sheep, burning the great hall and scattering the survivors to the winds. Among the dead was a young warrior named Eirik Thornson, barely 19 and newly betrothed to the Jarl's daughter. Among the missing was Elin Blooddaughter, fair-haired and gentle-handed, trained in the healing arts by her mother and beloved by all who knew her. Gunnar had survived the attack, but lost everything that mattered: his hall, his wife, his people, and most precious of all, his only child. For 3 years he had wandered the northern settlements, following every rumor of a fair-haired slave girl, praying to find his daughter alive and free her from whatever bondage she had fallen into. The description in the scroll matched Elin in every detail that mattered. The timing aligned with her arrival in Ravenshollow, and most damning of all, the message spoke of a betrothal to a young man named Eirik, the very name that Elin whispered when she looked at Bjorn with such perfect love and trust. Magnus set the scroll down with hands that trembled slightly, understanding at last the full scope of the tragedy that had been playing out under his roof. Elin was not just a slave with a mysterious past. She was a Jarl's daughter, stolen from her rightful place and confused about her own identity by trauma that had shattered more than just her memories. And Bjorn, noble, tormented Bjorn, had been living a lie that was even more complex than anyone had imagined. He was not merely pretending to be someone else. He was pretending to be a dead man, filling the place of a love that had been murdered along with everything else Elin had once known. "Where is she now?" Olaf asked quietly. "Gunnar wishes to see her, to determine if she is truly his lost daughter." "She lives with Bjorn Skarptooth," Magnus replied, his voice heavy with the weight of complications he was only beginning to understand. "They believe themselves to be lovers reunited after long separation." Olaf's eyebrows rose. "Believe themselves?" The girl's memories are confused. She thinks Bjorn is someone named Eirik, someone from her past. And Bjorn has allowed her to continue in this belief. The implications hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. If Elin was indeed Gunnar's daughter, then her enslavement had been illegal from the beginning. No Jarl's child could be rightfully held in bondage. If her true identity became known, questions would be raised about how she had come to be in such circumstances, questions that might lead to demands for compensation or even blood payment. And what of Bjorn? What did it mean for a man to love a woman who thought he was someone else? What did it mean when that someone else was dead, when the love she felt was built on a foundation of grief and confused memory? Magnus made his decision with the weight that befitted such a moment. "Bring Bjorn to me," he told his servants. "Tell him it concerns Elin, but say nothing more. And ask Astrid to come as well. We will need her wisdom before this day is done." When Bjorn arrived at the Jarl's hall, his massive frame filling the doorway like a storm cloud, Magnus could see the change that Elin's presence had wrought in him. The grim isolation was still there, but it was tempered now by something warmer, something that spoke of a man who had found reason to hope again. "You sent for me, my lord?" "Sit, Bjorn," Magnus said gently. "What I must tell you will not be easy to hear." He read the scroll aloud, watching Bjorn's face grow pale as the implications became clear. When he finished, the silence stretched between them like a chasm that neither man knew how to cross. "So the man she remembers, this Eirik, he's dead," Bjorn said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Killed 3 years ago, defending the woman he loved." Magnus folded the scroll carefully. "The woman who now believes you are him." Bjorn buried his face in his hands, and for a moment he looked less like a legendary warrior and more like a man drowning in the consequences of choices he had never meant to make. "What have I done to her?" he whispered. "What kind of monster builds happiness on such deception?" "A man who wanted to spare pain rather than cause it," Astrid said quietly. She had entered during the reading and stood now with the compassion of one who had seen how love could both heal and wound. "You're not the first to find that kindness and truth sometimes pull in different directions. But what do I do now?" Bjorn looked up, his eyes haunted. "How do I tell her that the man she loves is dead? How do I explain that everything she believes about us is built on lies?" "Perhaps," Magnus said carefully, "the question is not what you should have done, but what you must do now. Gunnar Bloodaxe comes seeking his daughter. If Elin is truly who we believe her to be, then she has family who have mourned her as dead for 3 years. They have a right to know she lives, and she has a right to know who she really is," Astrid added. "Noble blood runs in her veins, Bjorn. She's not a slave to be owned by anyone, not even someone who loves her as you do." Bjorn stood abruptly, pacing to the window where he could look out toward his longhouse and imagine Elin there, probably preparing their evening meal with the quiet contentment that had become so precious to him. The thought of destroying that peace, of watching her face crumble when she learned the truth, was almost more than he could bear. "Does she have to know immediately?" he asked, turning back to Magnus. "Could we not prepare her somehow? Help her remember gradually?" Magnus shook his head. "Gunnar arrives within the week. He will know his daughter on sight, and she will likely recognize him as well, despite her confused memories. The truth will come out whether we prepare for it or not. Then let me be the one to tell her, Bjorn said, with sudden intensity. If her world must be shattered again, let it be by someone who loves her, rather than by strangers. Give me that much, Magnus nodded slowly. Very well. But Bjorn, he paused, choosing his words with care. When the truth comes out, when she learns who she really is and who you are not, what then? Will you let her go back to her father's house? Will you release her from this life you've built together? It was the question that cut deepest, the one Bjorn had been avoiding since the moment he first allowed Elin to call him by another man's name. He loved her, not just the gentle girl who had transformed his existence, but the strong woman she was becoming under his protection. The thought of losing her was like contemplating his own death, but he was also beginning to understand that love sometimes meant making choices that served the beloved's good, rather than one's own desires. If Elin was truly a Jarl's daughter, then she deserved to know her heritage and choose her own path. If she had family searching for her, then they deserved to know she lived. I will do whatever makes her happiest, he said finally, though the words felt like they were tearing pieces from his soul, even if that means letting her go. The truth scroll lay on Magnus's table like a coiled serpent, its revelations ready to strike at the heart of everything Bjorn and Elin had built together. Soon, too soon, the fragile happiness they had constructed would face its greatest test. But as Bjorn walked home through the gathering dusk, preparing himself for the most difficult conversation of his life, he could not have known that the truth would prove even more complicated than the lies they had been living, or that love tested by fire sometimes emerges stronger than what came before. The ancient war horn that hung in Jarl Magnus's hall had not sounded in anger for over 2 years, not since the last serious raid on Raven's Hollow's borders. Carved from the horn of an aurochs that had lived when the world was younger, it bore runes of power and protection that seemed to pulse with their own inner light when danger threatened. Now, as Magnus lifted it from its place of honor, the weight of it seemed to carry the destiny of all who called Raven's Hollow home. 3 days had passed since the Truth Scroll's arrival, 3 days during which Bjorn had struggled to find words for the impossible conversation he knew he must have with Elin. Each morning, he woke with the intention of telling her everything, and each evening he went to sleep with the secret still burning in his chest like swallowed flame. But time was running out. Gunnar Bloodaxe's ship had been spotted by the harbour watch, still a day's sail away, but approaching with the steady inevitability of the tide. With him came not just a father seeking his lost daughter, but a complication that could unravel everything that had been woven between Bjorn and Elin over these precious weeks. Worse still, the ship that followed in Gunnar's wake flew banners that chilled the blood of every experienced warrior who saw them. Ragnar Ironwolf, the slave trader who had first brought Elin to these shores, had learned of Gunnar's search and was coming to defend his claim. If Elin was truly a Jarl's daughter illegally enslaved, then his entire operation faced exposure and ruin. He would not give up such valuable property without a fight. 2 ships, reported Eirik the watchman as he hurried into the hall where Magnus was meeting with his advisors. Gunnar's vessel and another flying Ironwolf's colors. They'll beach by tomorrow's dawn at the latest. Magnus felt the weight of leadership settle on his shoulders, like mail that had grown too heavy for comfort. The situation was spiraling beyond the simple matter of a father reclaiming his child. This was becoming a conflict that could spill blood on Raven's Hollow's soil and draw his people into feuds that stretched far beyond their borders. Sound the horn, he decided. Call all the warriors to council, and send word to Bjorn. Tell him his time for gentle revelations has ended. Elin must know the truth before her father arrives, or this reunion will become a battlefield. The war horn's deep, mournful note rolled across the village like thunder from a clear sky, bringing every able-bodied fighter running to answer its call. As the men gathered in the hall, farmers with axes, fishermen with spears, craftsmen with whatever weapons they could find, Magnus explained the situation with the brutal clarity that desperate times demanded. Gunnar Bloodaxe comes to claim his daughter, he announced. Ragnar Ironwolf comes to keep his slave. Both are bringing men ready to fight for what they believe is theirs. We must decide where Raven's Hollow stands in this matter. The girl's father has the stronger claim, said Thorold the blacksmith. No Jarl's child can be rightfully held in bondage. But Ironwolf has possession and the law of sale, countered Leif the merchant. He bought her fairly from the raiders who took her. Challenging him means challenging the entire slave trade. And what of Bjorn? Asked another voice. What of his claim as the man who protects her now? Magnus held up his hand for silence. That is for Bjorn and Elin to decide between themselves. Our duty is to ensure that whatever choice is made, it is made freely and without coercion. We will not let Raven's Hollow become a battleground for other men's feuds. But even as he spoke, Magnus knew that neutrality might prove impossible. The approaching ships carried more than just competing claims. They brought the threat of violence that could consume everyone in its path. Meanwhile, in his longhouse, Bjorn sat across from Elin at their simple wooden table. The truth scroll spread between them like a weapon that had not yet been drawn. He had been trying to find the right words for an hour, watching her gentle face in the firelight and knowing that what he was about to say would change everything between them. Elin looked up from the herb tea she had been preparing, noting the tension in his massive frame and the pain in his dark eyes. "Eirik," she said softly, using the name that had become both blessing and curse to him. "What troubles you so deeply? You've been like a caged bear these past days." The sound of the war horn, echoing across the village, made them both start. Its urgent call cutting through the domestic peace of their evening like a blade through silk. Elin's hand went instinctively to her throat, her eyes wide with the remembered terror of that morning when raiders had brought chaos to their world. "What does it mean?" she whispered. "Are we under attack again?" Bjorn stood slowly, his decision made by circumstances beyond his control. There was no more time for gentle preparations or careful explanations. The truth would come out now whether he willed it or not, and he could only hope that their love was strong enough to survive what he was about to reveal. "Elin," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "there's something I must tell you. Something about who you are and who I am not." She looked at him with growing alarm, seeing something in his expression that she had never witnessed before. Not just sorrow, but a kind of desperate honesty that spoke of secrets too heavy to carry any longer. "I don't understand," she said, rising to face him. "Eirik, you're frightening me." "That's just it," Bjorn said, the words coming out in a rush now that he had finally begun. "I'm not Eirik, I never was." "Eirik is dead, Elin. He died 3 years ago trying to save you from the raiders who destroyed your father's hall." The words hit her like physical blows, each one driving her back a step until she collided with the wall behind her. Her face went white as new snow, and for a moment Bjorn thought she might collapse under the weight of what he had told her. "No," she whispered. "That's not, you can't, we have memories together. You remember loving him," Bjorn said gently, moving toward her with his hands outstretched. "But I am not him. I'm Bjorn Skarptooth, the man who struck you down by accident during the raid. The man who has been living a lie because I couldn't bear to hurt you with the truth." Elin's breath came in short, sharp gasps as the carefully constructed world of her recovered memories began to crumble around her. She pressed her hands to her temples as if she could physically hold her thoughts together, but the truth was like water bursting through a broken dam. Once released, it could not be contained. "My father," she said suddenly, her voice stronger now as real memories began to surface through the confusion. "My father is Gunnar Bloodaxe. I am Elin Blooddaughter, not just a slave girl with no past." She looked at Bjorn with eyes that were clearing of their confusion, but filling with something else. Not anger, but a deep, aching sadness. "And you are the man who nearly killed me." "Yes," Bjorn said simply. "I am that man. But I am also the man who fell in love with you. Not because I thought you were someone else, but because of who you truly are." The war horn sounded again, closer now, and they could hear the sound of running feet and shouted orders as the village prepared for whatever was coming. but in the space between them, in the firelit interior of the longhouse that had become their shared refuge. Time seemed suspended as they faced the ruins of everything they had built together. "Your father comes to claim you," Bjorn continued, his voice steady despite the breaking of his heart. "Gunnar Bloodaxe has been searching for 3 years, following rumors and whispers across the northern settlements. He never stopped believing you were alive." Elin sank into her chair, as if her legs could no longer support her, her mind reeling as piece after piece of her true identity fell into place. She remembered now the great hall with its carved pillars, the apple orchards behind her father's house, her mother's gentle hands teaching her the healing arts that had survived even slavery. And she remembered Eirik, truly remembered him now, not as the man sitting before her, but as the young warrior whose love had been cut short by Raider's blade. "He died for me," she said softly. "Eirik died trying to reach me. And I gave his love to you, thinking you were him. You gave me a gift I never deserved," Bjorn replied. "You showed me what it meant to be loved, not for my strength or my reputation, but for the man I could become in your eyes. That was never Eirik's love, Elin. That was yours, freely given to the person you saw in me." The sound of approaching horses could be heard now, and the glow of torches was visible through the windows as armed men took their positions around the village. The confrontation that had been building for days was finally at hand, and soon there would be no more time for words or gentle explanations. "What happens now?" Elin asked, looking at him with eyes that held a lifetime of pain and confusion. "Now you choose," Bjorn said. "Your father has come to take you home, to restore you to your rightful place as his daughter and heir. Ragnar Ironwolf comes to defend his claim to you as property. And He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "I will fight anyone who tries to force you into a choice you don't want to make. Whatever you decide, Elin, I will stand by it." Outside, the war horn sounded a third time, its call echoing across the fjord like the voice of fate itself. The ships were close now, close enough that the choices that had seemed distant and theoretical were becoming immediate and deadly real. In the morning, blood might stain the shores of Raven's Hollow, but tonight, in the space between truth and consequence, Bjorn and Elin faced the most important decision of their lives, not as Eirik and his beloved, but as the people they truly were beneath all the lies and confusion, the woman who had been slave and Jarl's daughter both, and the man who had learned that sometimes the greatest strength lies in admitting your deepest weaknesses. The battle axe of truth was not a weapon meant for war, but for justice. Ancient beyond memory, its blade bore the sacred runes that had settled disputes among the northern clans since the time of the first settlers. When blood threatened to spill over matters of law and honor, the axe would be driven into the earth between the opposing forces, and trial by combat would determine which cause the gods favored. Now it stood planted in the sand of Raven's Hollow's beach, its worn handle rising toward the grey morning sky as 2 ships lay beached on either side of it. The symbolism was unmistakable. This matter would be settled by strength and will, not by words or negotiation. Gunnar Bloodaxe stood to the north of the axe, flanked by 20 seasoned warriors whose loyalty had been forged in the fires of shared loss. 3 years of searching had carved deep lines into his weathered face, and his grey-streaked beard spoke of a man who had aged beyond his years in pursuit of hope. But his eyes, pale blue like winter ice, burned with the fierce love of a father who had never stopped believing his daughter lived. "Elin," he called across the space between them, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "Elin, blood-daughter, child of my heart, I have come to take you home." To the south stood Ragnar Ironwolf, the slave trader whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his skill at turning human misery into profit. His men were fewer in number but well-armed and disciplined, mercenaries who served not love but gold. Ragnar himself was a lean, dangerous man, whose scarred hands had signed 1,000 bills of sale for human flesh. "The girl is mine by right of purchase," he declared, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I have documents sealed and witnessed. No father's tears can change what has been lawfully done." Between them, at the center of this deadly triangle, stood Elin herself. She wore a simple blue dress that Bjorn had bought for her in happier days, and her wheat gold hair was braided in the style of a free woman rather than a slave. But it was not her clothing that marked her transformation. It was the way she carried herself, with the dignity of one who had remembered her true name and heritage. "I know you, Father," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Your face came back to me in the night, along with memories of home and love, and the life that was stolen from me." She turned to face Ragnar, and her grey-green eyes held no fear, only a contempt that could have frozen flame. "And I know you as well, beast. You bought me from raiders like a piece of livestock and sold my body into bondage. For 3 years I served in chains because of your greed." Ragnar's laugh was like the scrape of steel on stone. "Slaves do not choose their fate, girl. You belong to whoever holds your chain, and your chain leads back to me." "No," Elin said with quiet firmness. "I am Elin, blood-daughter, free-born daughter of a jarl. I was never yours to sell." It was then that Bjorn stepped forward, moving to stand beside Elin with the battle axe of truth between him and the men who would claim her. He wore his finest mail and carried his father's restored shield. But it was not his weapons that made him formidable. It was the absolute certainty in his bearing, the look of a man who had found something worth dying for. "The lady has spoken," he said, his deep voice carrying across the beach like distant thunder. "She is no man's property. If either of you would take her against her will, you'll have to go through me first." Gunnar studied the giant warrior with appraising eyes, seeing not an enemy, but a protector. "You are Bjorn Skarptooth," he said. "I have heard of your reputation, but this is my daughter, blood of my blood. What claim do you make?" "The claim of a man who loves her," Bjorn replied simply. "Not because I mistake her for someone else, not because I own her or command her, but because she has chosen to give me her heart freely." He looked at Elin, and his scarred face softened with an expression that spoke of devotion deeper than any formal vow. "But if she chooses to go with you, to reclaim her place in your hall, I will not stand in her way." Ragnar spat in the sand, his patience exhausted by what he saw as pointless sentiment. "Enough of this. The girl comes with me, or I take her." He gestured to his men, who began to advance with weapons drawn. "Kill the giant. The father can watch his precious daughter sail away in chains." It was Elin who stopped them, stepping forward with her hand raised and her voice ringing with the authority of her noble blood. "Wait," she commanded, and something in her tone made even the hardened mercenaries pause. "This will be settled by law and honor, not by murder on a beach." She turned to face all 3 groups, her father's men, Ragnar's mercenaries, and the villagers of Raven's Hollow, who had gathered to witness whatever would unfold. When she spoke, it was with the clear, strong voice of a jarl's daughter who had found her power again. "My father has the right of blood to claim me," she said. "Ragnar has documents that he believes give him ownership, and Bjorn has the right of love, freely given and received." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Let trial by combat decide which claim the gods' favor. Single battle, to the death or yield. The winner takes all, my fate, my future, my choice of where I belong." Gunnar's face went pale. "Daughter, you cannot stake your life on a warrior's skill, no matter how mighty." "I stake it on justice," Elin replied, "and on the belief that the gods know the difference between love and possession, between family and slavery." She looked at Bjorn, and her eyes held both love and terrible sadness. "Will you fight for the right to let me choose my own path?" Bjorn drew his hammer slowly, its iron head catching the pale morning light. "I will fight," he said simply, "not to own you, but to free you. Whatever you choose after that, it will be your choice to make." The battle-axe of truth stood between them, like a judgment waiting to be rendered. And around its base, the fate of 3 people would soon be written in blood and courage. The victory crown was nothing more than wildflowers woven together by a child's hands, but it would become the most precious ornament any warrior had ever worn. Little Astrid, the healer's granddaughter, had gathered the blooms that morning from the meadow behind the village, late autumn flowers that had survived the first frost through stubborn determination, much like the love that had brought everyone to this beach. The combat itself was swift and decisive, though it felt like an eternity to those who watched. Ragnar Ironwolf had chosen his champion well, a massive warrior named Thorek the Red, whose reputation for savagery was matched only by his skill with blade and axe. But reputation means nothing when faced with a man fighting not for gold or glory, but for the right of the woman he loves to choose her own destiny. Bjorn fought with the controlled fury of a mountain avalanche, each blow of his hammer calculated and devastating. When Thorek's axe shattered against the restored shield that Elin had mended with her own hands, the symbolism was lost on no one. The weapon that had been broken and made whole again proved stronger than steel that had never known weakness. The final blow came when Thorek, desperate and bleeding, attempted a killing strike that would have taken Bjorn's head from his shoulders. But the giant warrior stepped inside the swing with the fluid grace of a master, bringing his hammer up in an arc that caught the red beneath his chin and lifted him clear off his feet. When Thorek hit the sand, he did not rise again. Ragnar stared at his fallen champion with the cold calculation of a merchant who has just lost a valuable investment. For a moment, it seemed he might call upon his remaining men to finish what single combat had started. But the battle-axe of truth stood between them still, and even a man like Ironwolf understood that to violate its judgment would bring the wrath of every honorable warrior in the northern settlements. "The girl is yours," he said to Bjorn with poisonous courtesy. "Enjoy your prize while you may. Such happiness never lasts." But Bjorn was not looking at Ragnar as the slave trader gathered his men and departed. His eyes were fixed on Elin, who had watched the combat with her hands pressed to her heart and tears streaming down her face. She ran to him as he stood over the fallen Thorek, her healing instincts compelling her to examine the cuts and bruises he had taken in the fight. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her gentle hands checking him for serious wounds. "That blow to your shoulder?" "I'm fine," he said softly, catching her hands in his massive ones. "But the fight is over, Elin. You're free to choose. Your father waits to take you home, to restore you to your rightful place as his daughter and heir. You can reclaim everything that was stolen from you." Gunnar approached them slowly, his weathered face wet with tears of joy and relief. "My daughter," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "My precious child, lost and found again. Come home with me, Elin. Come back to where you belong, Elin." Look between the two men, the father who had searched for her through 3 years of darkness, and the warrior, who had learned to love her not despite her damaged memories, but because of the strength she had shown in surviving them. Both offered her something precious. Gunnar offered heritage and family, while Bjorn offered the freedom to be whoever she chose to become. "Father," she said gently, turning to face Gunnar with the love of a daughter who had never stopped being his child. "I remember you now. I remember your stories by the fire, the way you taught me to read the runes, how you said I was the light of your life. I remember Mother's garden and the sound of her laughter. I remember being loved and safe and free." Gunnar's face brightened with hope, but Elin was not finished speaking. "But I also remember the woman I became in the darkness," she continued. "I remember learning that strength doesn't always come from noble blood or familiar halls. Sometimes it comes from choosing to love despite pain, from choosing to trust despite betrayal, from choosing to build something new from the ashes of what was lost." She turned to Bjorn, and her eyes held all the love that had grown between them, love that had begun in confusion but had deepened into something real and true and unbreakable. "You fought for my right to choose," she said, reaching up to touch his scarred face with infinite tenderness. "You could have kept silent about who I really was. You could have let me live in the gentle lie forever. But you gave me back my truth, even knowing it might cost you everything. From somewhere in the watching crowd, little Astrid stepped forward with her crown of wildflowers. The child had woven them during the combat, her small hands working with the unconscious skill of one who sees beauty even in moments of violence and fear. "For the victor," she said solemnly, holding up the simple circlet. But it was Elin who took the crown. Elin who placed it on Bjorn's dark head with reverence, usually reserved for the crowning of kings. The rough warrior who had learned gentleness knelt in the sand as she crowned him, not with gold or silver, but with flowers that would wither and fade, a perfect symbol of love that was precious precisely because it was fragile and brief and chose to bloom anyway. "I choose you," she whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Not as Eirik, not as a replacement for what was lost, but as Bjorn, as the man who showed me that broken things can be mended into something stronger than they were before. The crown of wildflowers sat crooked on his massive head, and in that moment, Bjorn Skarptooth looked less like a legendary warrior and more like what he had always been beneath the reputation and the scars, a man who had found someone worth fighting for, worth changing for, worth being gentle for. The victory was complete, but it was not the victory anyone had expected when the day began. The new hearthstone was grey granite, streaked with veins of silver, chosen not for its beauty, but for its strength. Bjorn and Elin had carried it together from the quarry beyond the village, their 4 hands working in harmony to place it at the exact center of their rebuilt home. It was heavier than the old stone, more difficult to position, but it would last for generations, a foundation built to endure whatever storms might come. 6 months had passed since the trial by combat on the beach. 6 months during which Ravenshollow had watched 2 people transform not just themselves, but the very meaning of what love could be when it was freely chosen, rather than desperately grasped. The longhouse that had once stood as a monument to Bjorn's isolation had been expanded and brightened, its walls echoing now with laughter and the soft conversations of a couple who had learned to build happiness on truth rather than comfortable lies. Spring had returned to the fjord, bringing with it the familiar rhythms of planting and fishing and the eternal work of coaxing life from the harsh northern soil. But this spring was different from any that had come before. Marked by changes that went deeper than the turning of seasons, Elin moved through their home with the graceful efficiency of a woman who had found her place in the world. But the changes in her went far beyond domestic contentment. She had established herself as Ravenshollow's primary healer, her knowledge and gentle touch sought out by everyone from colicky babies to warriors nursing old wounds. The village women, who had once pitied her as a broken slave, now came to her for advice on everything from difficult births to marital disputes, recognizing in her a wisdom that had been forged in suffering and tempered by choice. "The Thornton baby is finally sleeping through the night," she reported to Bjorn one evening as she returned from a day of visits to patients throughout the village. "And old Magnus says his back hasn't pained him since I taught him those stretching exercises you suggested." Bjorn looked up from the cradle he was building, his massive hands surprisingly delicate as they fitted the wooden joints together. The cradle was larger than most, built to accommodate what Astrid the healer had predicted would be a substantial child, given the size of both parents. The baby was not due until late summer, but Bjorn had begun the work early, wanting every detail to be perfect. "You give me too much credit for knowledge I don't possess," he said, with the gentle humor that had become his usual way of deflecting praise. "I know how to mend weapons and armor, not people." "You knew how to mend me," Elin replied, settling beside him on the bench and running her fingers over the smooth wood of the cradle's rim. "Though I suppose we mended each other, didn't we?" The truth of that observation settled between them like a comfortable silence. Bjorn had indeed changed under Elin's influence, but not in the way either of them had expected during those early days of deception and confused identity. He had not become someone else. He had become more fully himself, the man he had always been capable of being when love gave him reason to lay down his emotional armor. The village had watched this transformation with wonder and growing respect. Where once Bjorn had been feared for his strength, he was now valued for his wisdom. Young warriors came to him not just for training in combat, but for advice on life, marriage, and the delicate art of balancing strength with gentleness. The man who had lived in isolation for so long had become a cornerstone of community life. Consulted on everything from settling disputes to planning the village's defenses. Gunnar's ship was spotted this morning, Bjorn mentioned casually, as he tested the cradle's stability. The harbour masters think he'll beach by evening. Elin nodded, unsurprised by the news. Her father had visited 3 times since her choice to remain in Raven's Hollow, each visit lasting longer than the one before, as he came to understand that his daughter's happiness was not something he needed to rescue her from. The initial tension between Gunnar and Bjorn had gradually given way to mutual respect and something approaching friendship. Both men loved Elin, and both had learned that love sometimes meant accepting choices that served the beloved's good rather than their own preferences. "He's bringing the marriage gift," Elin said with quiet satisfaction. "The formal recognition from the northern Jarls that our union is legitimate. Not that we needed their approval," she added with a smile. "But it will make things easier for our children. The children, already they spoke of them as certainties rather than hopes, though only one had yet made its presence known, through the gentle rounding of Elin's belly and the morning sickness that had finally begun to ease. But in their conversations about the future, there were always children, a houseful of them, growing up secure in the knowledge that they were wanted and loved and free to choose their own paths when the time came. "I've been thinking about names," Bjorn said, his attention seemingly focused on the cradle, but his voice carrying the weight of deeper considerations. "If it's a boy, I thought, perhaps Eirik, to honor the man whose love made our meeting possible, even if neither of us understood it at the time." Elin's hands stilled on the cradle's edge, and for a moment her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness but of a kind of profound gratitude that encompassed both the love she had lost and the love she had found. "He would have liked that," she said softly. "He would have liked knowing that his name was carried forward by a child born of true choice rather than obligation." The hearthstone caught the firelight and held it, its silver veins gleaming like threads of starlight woven through solid rock. It was a beautiful thing in its way, but more importantly, it was strong, like the love that had brought them together. It had been chosen for endurance rather than mere beauty, built to last through whatever storms the future might bring. As evening approached and the signal fires announced Gunnar's arrival, Bjorn and Elin prepared to welcome the father who had learned to love his daughter's choices even when they differed from his own dreams. The longhouse that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the voices of family and friends, a gathering place for all who understood that the strongest foundations are built on truth, choice, and the courage to love without guarantees. Outside, the fjord reflected the colors of sunset like a mirror made of gold and crimson. Inside, by the light of the fire that burned over their new hearthstone, 2 people who had found each other through the strangest combination of accident and intention continued the patient work of building a life together. One day, one choice, one act of love at a time. Sometimes the worst mistakes we make do indeed become the greatest blessings we never expected. Sometimes love finds us when our hearts are closed and our hands are stained with regret. And sometimes, if we are very fortunate, we learn that the strongest bonds are forged not in the ease of perfect understanding, but in the crucible of truth faced together, choices made freely, and the daily decision to see in each other not what we wish for, but what actually is. In the end, that proved to be more than enough.